The room was packed with people, their voices blending into a steady hum of anticipation. It wasn't every day that someone like Donald Trump came to speak at a local town hall, and the crowd, composed of both supporters and skeptics, buzzed with excitement. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured among themselves, and security stood at attention, watching everything with sharp eyes. As Trump took the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He waved, flashed that familiar confident smile, and leaned into the microphone. His speeches were always unpredictable, sometimes bold, sometimes controversial, but never dull. People listened, some nodding in agreement, others waiting for something they could challenge. But then, something unexpected happened. A small hand shot up from the middle of the crowd. It belonged to a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. She had bright, curious eyes and clutched a small notepad in her hands. The moderator hesitated for a moment before gesturing to her. "We have a young lady here with a question." The room fell silent. It was rare for a child to ask a question at an event like this, and for a brief moment, even Trump seemed slightly caught off guard. He adjusted his tie and nodded. "All right, let's hear it," he said, his voice carrying the usual mix of authority and intrigue. The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother for reassurance. Then, gripping the microphone tightly, she spoke in a soft but clear voice. "Mr. Trump, do you believe in God?" The air in the room shifted. Conversation stopped. Even the journalists, who were usually quick to scribble notes, seemed momentarily frozen. It was a question so simple, yet so powerful. And coming from a child, it carried an innocence that made it impossible to ignore. Trump's expression changed, just for a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but those watching closely could see it. He wasn't just listening to the words, he was processing them. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. Some were eager to hear his response, others were skeptical. A question about faith, especially in such a public setting, was never easy to answer. And yet, the little girl stood there, waiting, not as a voter, not as a critic, but as a child who simply wanted to know the truth. Trump took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. Then, he leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than before. "That's a very important question," he said. "And I'll tell you something." The girl tilted her head, her small fingers gripping the microphone tighter. The entire room was hanging on his next words. But before he could continue, something happened, something that no one expected. A single tear rolled down the little girl's cheek. The audience gasped. Even Trump, a man known for his composure, paused. The cameras zoomed in. The journalists who had been waiting for a political answer suddenly realized that this was something different, something raw, something real. What had made her cry? Was it something in his voice? Something she had seen in his eyes? Or was it the weight of the moment itself? Whatever it was, everyone in that room could feel it. And then, as Trump finally spoke his next words, the entire atmosphere of the event shifted in a way that no one could have predicted. The room remained frozen in silence. All eyes were on the little girl, her small face illuminated by the bright stage lights. The single tear that had slipped down her cheek was now followed by another, though she wasn't sobbing, just standing there, clutching the microphone as if she had asked something far greater than she could fully understand. Trump's expression remained unreadable for a moment. He studied the girl carefully, his usual commanding presence now touched by something quieter, something almost reflective. The crowd could sense the shift. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about the usual back and forth of opinions and debates. This was different. The girl blinked, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. I just want to know," she whispered, her voice so soft that the microphone barely caught it. Trump nodded slowly, then took a step closer to the edge of the stage. His voice, usually booming and filled with certainty, was calmer now. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amy," she answered. "Amy," he repeated, as if testing the name, letting it settle in the air. He glanced at the audience briefly, then back at her. "You asked if I believe in God." She nodded. he exhaled, shifting his stance slightly. You see, Amy, when you grow up, you start seeing the world differently. You see how complicated things can be, how people don't always agree, how life isn't always fair. His voice didn't carry its usual sharp edges. It was almost personal. But no matter where I've been, no matter what I've seen, there's one thing I've always known. The audience held their breath, waiting. I've known that faith is powerful, he continued. That believing in something greater than yourself, it gives you strength. It gives people hope. Amy's eyes were wide, searching his face, trying to understand something deeper than just words. My mother was a woman of faith, he added, his voice dipping lower. She taught me that no matter how much success you have, no matter how much power you hold, there's always something bigger than you. And I've seen it, Amy. I've seen people pray when they had nothing left. I've seen people hold on to faith even when the world told them not to. The room was still. The journalists who had been waiting for a headline seemed momentarily unsure of what to write. The energy in the air wasn't political anymore. It wasn't even just about the question. It was about something deeper, something everyone, no matter their beliefs, could feel. Amy swallowed hard. Then, do you think he listens? Trump's gaze didn't waver. I do. She took a shaky breath. Even to kids like me? For the first time that evening, a small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Especially to kids like you. Amy's lower lip trembled slightly. She opened her mouth, as if to say something else, but then hesitated. Her tiny fingers fidgeted with the edges of her notepad. There was something she wasn't saying, something lingering just beneath the surface. Trump noticed. Amy, he said gently, why did you ask me that? The microphone shook slightly in her grip. She glanced back at her mother, who was standing near the crowd, her hands clasped together, her eyes shining with something unspoken. Then, Amy looked back at Trump, and her voice wavered. Because my dad used to say that God always listens, she whispered, but he's gone now. A ripple of emotion spread through the crowd. A few gasps, a murmur of sympathy. Even the security guards, who had been standing stiff and focused, seemed to shift slightly, their expressions softening. Trump's face didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Understanding. Recognition. What happened to your dad? He asked, his voice steady, but kind. Amy hesitated again, her small fingers tightening around the microphone. The room was deathly quiet. No one dared to speak, no one dared to interrupt. And then, just as she parted her lips to answer, a sudden noise. A loud click. The sound was sharp, distinct. It came from somewhere in the audience. Kind of sound that didn't belong in a place like this. Security instantly reacted, scanning the crowd, their hands moving toward their radios. A few heads turned, searching. The tension that had been emotional only moments ago suddenly shifted into something else. Something colder. Amy flinched at the noise, her hands trembling slightly. Trump's gaze snapped toward his security team, his instincts kicking in. He had been in the public eye long enough to know when something felt off. And right now, something definitely felt off. The audience murmured, shifting in their seats. Amy looked up at him again, her voice now a whisper only he could hear. Does God listen even when you're afraid? Trump met her eyes, his own unreadable. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head, scanning the crowd himself. The atmosphere had changed, no longer just about faith, no longer just about a little girl's question. Something was happening. And whatever it wasn't over yet. A hush fell over the room, the energy shifting into something more tense, more uncertain. The sound had been small, just a sharp click, but in a setting like this, with security already on high alert, it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. Trump's security team was already moving, scanning the audience with sharp eyes, murmuring into their earpieces. Amy was still gripping the microphone, her fingers pale from how tightly she held it. She looked up at Trump, waiting, searching his face for reassurance. But for the first time that evening, he wasn't looking at her, his gaze was moving across the crowd, his mind working through possibilities. He had been in too many unpredictable situations before. He knew when something didn't feel right. A woman near the back of the room shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A man in a dark suit, standing near the side, subtly adjusted his stance. Someone whispered something too low to be heard, and for a brief moment, it felt like everyone in the room was holding their breath. Amy's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Trump?" He looked back at her, and for a second, his expression softened. He placed a hand on the podium and leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice so only she, and maybe a few others close by, could hear. "You asked me if God listens even when you're afraid." She nodded, her big eyes locked onto his. "He does," Trump said firmly. "But sometimes, he also wants you to pay attention." Amy blinked, unsure what he meant, but before she could ask, one of the security guards subtly motioned to Trump's team. A small sign, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Trump straightened, adjusting his tie, then addressed the crowd with his usual air of control. "All right, folks, let's keep going," he said, his voice steady, though there was something in his tone, something watchful. "Amy here is asking the kind of questions that really matter." He glanced back down at her. "And she's got courage. That's something we don't see enough of these days." Amy's lip trembled slightly, but she nodded. The crowd murmured in agreement, though there was still tension in the air, an unspoken feeling that something wasn't quite right. And then, just as things seemed to settle, another sound. This time, it was a deep, metallic clank, coming from somewhere near the back of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A chair scraping against the floor. A movement that didn't quite fit. Trump's security team was fully alert now. The murmurs in their radios were more urgent. A few men in black suits subtly moved toward the edges of the room, watching, waiting. Amy's mother took a cautious step forward, her eyes darting toward her daughter. Trump noticed. He glanced at the security near the stage, then back at Amy. "Tell you what," he said, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Why don't you come up here for a second?" Amy hesitated. "On the stage?" He nodded. "Yeah. I think you've got more to say, and I want to hear it." The audience watched as the little girl took a small step forward, then another. Trump reached out a hand, steadying her as she climbed the few short steps onto the platform. The moment she reached the top, there was movement near the back. A man stood up, quickly. Too quickly. Several security guards reacted instantly, moving toward him. The man hesitated, then raised his hands slightly, as if realizing he had drawn too much attention. A few people near him shifted nervously in their seats. "Sit down, sir," one of the security members said firmly. The man hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat. But something about him, his posture, the way he kept his hands in his lap, set off alarm bells. Trump, still standing beside Amy, didn't react outwardly, but he wasn't ignoring it either. He had seen too many moments like this before, moments where the energy in the room changed in a way you couldn't quite explain, but you knew it meant something. Amy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Trump," she whispered. He glanced down at her, lowering his voice again. "Yeah?" Her hands fidgeted nervously. "I think something's wrong." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, just slightly. The room was still filled with tension, but the event had to go on. Trump turned back to the microphone, addressing the audience with his usual confidence, as if nothing unusual had happened. But beneath the surface, there was something unspoken. Something moving just beneath the surface of this night. Amy clutched her notepad tightly. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had changed. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Amy stood close to Trump, her small hands gripping the edges of her notepad as if holding on to something solid in the growing uncertainty. The energy in the room was shifting, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The man who had stood too quickly now sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the stage. But something about him still felt off, too still, too controlled. Trump's security detail had subtly adjusted their positions. The men in black suits along the edges of the room were no longer just watching, they were anticipating. Their hands hovered near their earpieces, their sharp eyes scanning every movement in the crowd. They had seen moments like this before. Trump, however, remained composed. His expression unreadable, his posture strong. If he had noticed the shift in the atmosphere, he wasn't showing it. Instead, he turned his attention back to Amy, his voice steady. "You asked me if God listens when we're afraid," he said, keeping his focus on her. "And you asked that for a reason, didn't you?" Amy hesitated, her fingers twitching against the cover of her notebook. She nodded, but her eyes flickered toward the audience, toward her mother, then back toward the man who had stood moments ago. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, but she didn't have the words to explain it. Trump lowered his voice slightly, just enough so only she, and maybe the first few rows of the audience, could hear. "Are you afraid now, Amy?" She swallowed hard. Then, barely above a whisper, she answered, "Yes." He nodded once, his expression not changing. Then he straightened, his attention shifting back to the crowd. A small commotion started near the back of the room. It was nothing loud, just a few people shifting, a security guard moving closer to the man who had caused the earlier disturbance. The murmur of voices was quiet, but the tension was spreading. People could feel it now. A strange, unsettling energy creeping in. Amy's mother, standing near the side of the room, took a small step forward, her eyes locked on her daughter. Her expression was tight, her hands clasped together, but there was something else in her face, something only a mother could feel. Trump's security detail exchanged brief glances. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But Trump caught it. He wasn't just standing on a stage anymore. He was in the middle of something. Amy's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She could sense it too, even if she didn't fully understand what was happening. Then, without warning, a sudden movement. The man in the back stood again, this time faster. More urgent. Trump's security moved instantly, closing in. The audience gasped, heads turning toward the disturbance. A woman near the man let out a small cry, scrambling back in her seat. Amy flinched, stepping instinctively closer to Trump. Then, a loud command from security. "Sir, sit down." The room was frozen. The man hesitated. His hands twitched at his sides, his face unreadable. Trump didn't move. He didn't speak. But his eyes were locked on the scene, his years of experience in high-pressure situations keeping him composed. Amy clutched her notebook so tightly her fingers ached. And then, the man slowly, deliberately, lowered himself back into his seat. The tension didn't ease. The guards stayed close, their hands resting near their radios, their bodies still on high alert. The energy in the room had shifted into something thick, something unshakable. Trump finally exhaled, just slightly, before looking down at Amy again. "You asked me if God listens when you're afraid," he said, his voice steady. Amy nodded, unable to speak. Trump glanced at the audience, at the faces filled with tension, with unease. Then, he looked back at her. "He does." Amy's lips parted, but before she could respond, another sound. This time, closer. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The sound came from the side of the room, a sharp, unexpected noise that made people flinch. A chair scraped against the floor, followed by the sudden shuffle of hurried footsteps. The security team reacted instantly, moving toward the disturbance. The tension in the room was unbearable now, thick enough to drown out every other sound. Amy's grip on her notebook tightened. She could feel her heartbeat hammering inside her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew something was wrong. The way Trump's security moved, the way the audience barely whispered, everyone was holding their breath. Trump's expression remained unreadable, but his stance shifted just slightly, like he was preparing for something. His eyes flickered toward the security team, watching, assessing. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize the feeling in the air. This wasn't over. Not yet. A guard near the side of the room suddenly reached for his earpiece, his face tightening. Another guard subtly positioned himself between Trump and the audience. There was no outright panic, no chaos, but something was happening beneath the surface, something only the trained eyes in the room could see. Amy's mother was moving now, stepping forward, trying to get closer to the stage. Her expression was tight with concern, her eyes locked onto her daughter. Amy saw her lips move, but the words were lost in the thick silence. Then, just as things seemed to settle, a man near the entrance abruptly stood up. It wasn't the same man who had caused trouble earlier. This was someone different. His movements were too sharp, too purposeful. The security team was already reacting, but before anyone could stop him, he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Mr. Trump, I have a question." The way he said it sent a chill through the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone turn toward him. The security team was already closing in, but Trump raised a hand slightly, just enough to signal them to hold back for a moment. The man's hands were visible, but his posture was tense. Too tense. Amy's stomach twisted. Trump's expression remained calm, controlled. "Go ahead," he said, his voice firm. The man's eyes flickered toward Amy for the briefest second before returning to Trump. Then, slowly, he asked, "Do you think God chooses leaders, or do leaders just choose themselves?" A strange silence filled the room. The question was simple, but something about the way he said it, the way his voice didn't waver, made it feel like it held a deeper meaning. Trump didn't answer immediately. He studied the man, his years of experience telling him that this was no ordinary question. There was something behind it, something intentional. Amy shifted on her feet, glancing between Trump and the man. She didn't understand why, but she suddenly felt colder. Like something was pressing in around her, an invisible weight that made it harder to breathe. Trump finally spoke, his voice measured. "That's an interesting question," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But let me ask you something, do you think God only chooses leaders, or does he also test them?" The man's jaw tightened. For a split second, something flashed in his expression, something dark, unreadable. Amy felt her stomach drop. Then, before anyone could say another word, the lights flickered. A single, sharp crack echoed through the speakers, and the room plunged into chaos. The room was swallowed in darkness. Gasps rippled through the audience, chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted, unsure whether to run or stay frozen in place. Amy clutched her notebook to her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Somewhere in the crowd, she could hear her mother's voice calling her name, but it was lost in the confusion. Then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back on. But something had changed. The man who had asked the question was gone. Trump's security detail was already in motion, their voices sharp and controlled as they scanned the room. The audience remained in stunned silence, eyes darting around, searching for the man who had vanished. Trump himself stood firm, his expression unreadable, his years of experience keeping him composed. Amy felt an icy shiver crawl down her spine. The room felt different now. Like something had shifted, something unseen but undeniable. She turned her gaze back to Trump, expecting him to say something, to break the silence. Instead, he did something unexpected. He crouched down to her level, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Amy," he said, his tone steady but softer now, more personal. "Do you still feel afraid?" Amy hesitated. She wanted to say yes, but something inside her told her to stop and think. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something else, something stronger. She met his gaze and, with a small voice, said, "Not as much." Trump gave a small nod, almost like he had expected that answer. Then he stood back up, looking toward the audience, toward his security team, and finally toward the space where the man had been. A murmur spread through the crowd, hushed whispers trying to make sense of what had just happened. The event had gone from a simple Q&A to something that felt far bigger, far stranger. People were unsettled, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Then, from the back of the room, someone gasped. A woman pointed toward the stage, not at Trump, not at Amy, but at the floor beneath them. Amy followed her gaze, and that's when she saw it. Lying there, as if it had been placed on purpose, was a single torn page from a notebook. Amy's notebook. Her breath hitched as she crouched down, hesitating before picking it up. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page over, revealing shaky, handwritten words in her own handwriting. But she hadn't written them. She knew she hadn't. The message was simple. Just 6 words. You already know the answer, Amy. Her blood ran cold. Trump glanced at the page, then back at her. His expression remained unreadable, but for the first time, Amy thought she saw something in his eyes. Not fear, not confusion, just understanding. A strange hush fell over the room. The security team was still searching for the man, still scanning the crowd, still trying to make sense of what had happened. But Amy knew they wouldn't find him. Because whoever he was already gone. Trump exhaled slowly, then turned back to the audience, his voice calm but firm. Faith is a powerful thing, he said, letting his words settle over the room. Sometimes, the answers we're looking for have been with us all along. Amy stared at the page in her hands, the words still burning in her mind. She didn't understand everything that had happened that night. She didn't know who the man was, or how he had disappeared, or why he had left her that message. But one thing was clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. The room remained silent, but something had shifted. The energy, the tension, it was no longer fear or confusion but a deep, unspoken understanding. Amy looked down at the page in her hands again, reading the words over and over, as if the more she looked, the more they would make sense. But deep down, she already knew what they meant. Trump's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the audience. The event was still ongoing, but after everything that had just happened, it felt as though something had already been answered, something beyond words. He gave a slight nod to his security team, signaling for them to relax. The unknown man was gone, but his question, and the moment it created, was still heavy in the air. Amy's mother finally made her way through the crowd, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Amy nodded, gripping the page tightly. "I think so." Her mother studied her for a moment, then glanced at Trump, who still stood tall, composed as ever. It was hard to tell what he was thinking, but Amy had a feeling that he understood more than he was letting on. The event continued, but it wasn't the same. The remaining questions were asked, but there was a shift in the room, a newfound attentiveness, a quiet contemplation that lingered over every word spoken. People weren't just hearing the responses, they were feeling them. As the event came to a close, Trump took one last look at Amy before stepping away from the stage. Security guided him through the back, and just like that, the moment was over. But for Amy, it wasn't. She kept the torn page tucked safely in her notebook, her fingers brushing over the edges as she and her mother stepped outside into the cool night air. The crowd was still buzzing, people discussing what had happened, speculating about the strange man and his sudden disappearance. But Amy wasn't interested in the theories. She was thinking about the message. You already know the answer, Amy. She thought about the question she had asked earlier. About God. About belief. About why things happen the way they did. And for the first time, she realized something. Maybe she had been searching for an answer outside of herself when, all along, it had been inside her. She looked up at her mother, who was watching her with quiet curiosity. "Do you believe God chooses leaders?" Amy asked softly. Her mother smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I think God gives everyone a purpose. But it's up to us to listen." Amy let those words sink in. Maybe that was the real answer. Maybe faith wasn't about waiting for a sign, it was about recognizing the ones that were already there. As they walked toward their car, Amy glanced back at the building one last time. The lights from inside still glowed, casting long shadows on the pavement. She didn't know who the man was, or how he had disappeared so suddenly. But somehow, she wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt at peace. She looked down at the page in her hand one last time before slipping it into her notebook. Then, taking a deep breath, she closed it, holding it close to her heart. And with that, she walked forward, no longer searching, but finally understanding.